And get right into that. Let's see, where are we? There we go. Cranial nerves, cranial nerves. What are they? Where are they? What do they do? And why do I care? All right. So cranial nerves, we've discussed this several times throughout the course, are going to be nerves that are going to come off of the brain. They are a part of the peripheral nervous system, right? There are 12 pairs, a left and a right cranial nerve for whatever cranial nerve we're talking about. A left and right oculomotor nerve, a left and right facial nerve. When we're using, all right, the nomenclature for how to number the cranial nerves, you will use the Roman numerals, right? The Roman numerals. And so when they were labeling those, they started with the nerve that was the most anterior, and we labeled that as the lowest Roman numeral. So the most anterior cranial nerve is olfactory. And then we went down the brainstem from there. And so when we're going to be talking about these cranial nerves, we're going to discuss, all right, obviously their location and what they do. And basically cranial nerves are either sensory in function, motor in function, or both. So they can be either or both. So here you can see a picture here of our cranial nerves coming off the inferior and anterior portion of your brainstem here. So again, our most anterior nerve is going to be the olfactory. That's cranial nerve number 1. And then we'll wind up and finish up with way back here, hypoglossal. That's cranial nerve number 12. So we'll walk through these. I will send you folks out some pictures in an email here so you can label your lab atlas. All right, some of these pictures are tough to actually see. So I will send that out for you, all right, tonight. Okay, so cranial nerve number 1, all right, is the olfactory nerve. How I remembered that is I have one nose. Okay, so cranial nerve number 1 is sensory in nature, and it has one job, and that's the smell. Real simple. Now you'll see it, all right, this region here, let's zoom in a little bit. All right, this region here you can see is the frontal lobe here. And so the olfactory nerve is going to sit along the inferior portion of the frontal lobe here. All right, so there's a couple components, and we get into chapter 16 when we go over the special senses. We'll get more into detail, all right, on this nerve here. But you'll notice you have the neurons here from cranial nerve 1, and they actually are going to pass down through the cribriform plate. And if you recall, the cribriform plate was part of the ethmoid bone. You had these holes there, and those were called the olfactory foramina. And so the neurons, all right, of the cranial nerves will pierce through the cribriform plate and into what we call the olfactory epithelium, where there's some mucus here and whatnot. And that's where the nerve endings for the cranial nerves will reside, in the superior portion here of your nasal cavity. That's why it's really important, if you really want to get a good whiff of something or a good smell of something, when you're breathing in that air, you want to inhale it nice and deep so it circulates and swirls around and hits, all right, those olfactory nerves up there, so we can get the best sense of smell. Hopefully it's something that's pleasing, okay? And so it's something you want to, helping to take that deep breath in will help with that. Okay. Our second cranial nerve number 2, is the optic nerve. How I remember that is I've got 2 eyes, so optic nerve is cranial nerve number 2. This is another sensory nerve, and so its job is for vision. All right, so you'll see here it's kind of a complicated route that the cranial nerve, all right, the optic nerve takes, but each eye has its own optic nerve. So the optic nerve forms here at the posterior portion of the retina, and it will move posteriorly back towards the brainstem. and then the optic nerves will cross over and combine with one another at the optic chiasm. And then from there, all right, we have the optic tracts. And then from the optic tracts, we'll see, all right, several axon projections that will head back towards the visual cortex and the occipital lobe. All right, so this will provide, all right, the occipital lobe with sensory information, all right, that it received in the retina of the eye. All right, so that's cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve. Cranial nerve number 3, we talked about this tonight earlier on, the ocular motor nerve. Right, this is a cranial nerve that is motor in function, and its responsibility. Let's move aside the parasympathetic functions to cranial nerve 3. For right now, right, cranial nerve number 3 is going to control most of the muscles that will move the eye, and it will also control the muscle that lifts your eyelid. And then we saw earlier, all right, in lecture, how it changes the pupil diameter. Right? It will cause constriction because it will stimulate the sphincter pupillae muscle to cause the pupil to constrict. And also, it plays a role with the ciliary muscle, and it will change the shape of the lens for accommodation. All right, so keep in mind, all right, when we're talking about ocular motor nerve, cranial nerve 3, it tells you what it's doing. It's going to move the eye. There are 6 extrinsic eye muscles, and the ocular motor nerve will innervate 4 of them. When we get into chapter 16, we'll talk more about that. Okay, the 4th cranial nerve is the trochlear nerve, another motor nerve that has to do with the eye, and it has one job. It is going to control the superior oblique muscle of the eye. So if we look at this picture here, we zoom in, here's the superior oblique muscle right over here. It sits right in the corner, the upper corner of the eye by the nose. And you'll notice, all right, the muscle here has the tendon, and the tendon goes through this structure called the trochlea. Trochlea means pulley. So that trochlea will actually act as a pulley, because you can see that tendon takes a sharp turn and it attaches here, all right, to the superior lateral portion of the eye. So when that muscle contracts, it'll help you to look down and out, down and away is going to be the motion and movement for the superior oblique muscle. I always thought down and out. All right, so that's cranial nerve number 4. Still not too bad. Now we got trigeminal nerve. This is our first mixed nerve. So it has both sensory function and it has motor function. The sensory function is that it receives somatic sensation from the face. So the trigeminal nerve is made up of 3 divisions or branches. You have the ophthalmic branch, you have then the maxillary branch, and then our mandibular branch. All right, so the ophthalmic branch is going to send sensory information from basically your forehead. The maxillary branch is going to send sensory information from the maxillary portion or your upper jaw of your face. And then the mandibular branch will send sensory information from the mandibular area of your face. So those 3 different branches will send that input there. So easy way to test this nerve, if you want to see how the sensory component is doing, have the patient close their eyes, take a small wisp of cotton, and then you brush it across their face, all right, like on the forehead or on the cheek or on the chin to one side. And you say, okay, can you please tell me what you felt? All right. And they'll tell you, all right, I felt something soft hit my face. Can you please point to that area? If they're able to correctly identify all that, then you know that the sensory component of the trigeminal nerve is okay. The motor component, easy to remember, involves the muscles of mastication or chewing. Remember the masseter muscle and the temporalis? Those muscles are involved, all right, in mastication. So if you want to test the motor component for this nerve, you just ask the person to open and close their jaw. It's that easy. All right, trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve number 5. Cranial nerve number 5. All right, the next cranial nerve is cranial nerve number 6, abducens. This is another easy nerve to remember because one, it is motor only, and it only controls one muscle of the eye, and that's the lateral rectus. This is the muscle that will move your eye to look out towards your ear. So that's AB, abduction. And so we correctly named, all right, this nerve, the abducens, because it means to move away from the midline. So you'll look out towards your ears. And I probably should have pointed this out to you. You can see nicely here on the right, the left side of these slides here, where these nerves are specifically on the brainstem. So you can see the abducens here is found in between the pons and the medulla oblongata. If we go back to the previous slide here, you can, well, you can't see it on that, but you can see it on the trochlea. All right, if we zoom in, you can see the trochlea nerve is coming right off of the pons there. All right, one of my favorites, cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve, another mixed nerve. So it has a sensory component and a motor component. The motor component is for all the muscles of facial expression. Easy enough to remember. If you want to test those muscles, ask the patient to squint their eyes, smile, frown, puff out their cheeks. All of that will help, all right, in challenging the motor component there of the muscles of facial expression. Also, when we're talking about the sensory component, it's going to conduct taste sensation from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. The anterior 2/3 of the tongue, all right, for taste, facial nerve carries that sensory input, all right, to the central nervous system. And then, of course, when we were talking about, all right, the parasympathetic nervous system, we learned that the facial nerve, all right, had a role to play with the lacrimal gland and some of your salivary glands, specifically the submandibular and the sublingual glands, all right, when we're dealing with the parasympathetic role of the facial nerve. Don't forget, cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10 also have a role in the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. All right, that's cranial nerve number 7. Number 8's easy. Vestibular cochlear nerve. Even its name, it's a compound name. All right, 2 things it's saying in its name. The vestibular portion, which is like balance, I shouldn't say balance, but more like equilibrium. All right, cochlear has to do with hearing. This is a purely sensory nerve that plays a role in both hearing and equilibrium. And so this nerve has 2 branches, right? It's got the cochlear branch of the vestibular cochlear nerve, and that's going to go towards your inner ear. Then it's got the vestibular branch of the vestibular cochlear nerve, and that goes towards the vestibular apparatus, which helps with equilibrium. Okay, if your head is in a forward position, in a back position, right? We get to talk about all that fun and exciting special senses in chapter 16 in our last chapter for this semester here. All right, so vestibular cochlear nerve is purely sensory. All right, glossopharyngeal, another mixed nerve here, right? And so it deals with, for the sensory component, both taste and touch, right? When we're talking about taste, we're dealing with the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, okay? Motor control, you have a specific muscle called the stylopharyngeus, and so it will control the stylopharyngeus muscle located, all right, in the posterior component of your throat. And of course, glossopharyngeal is also part of the parasympathetic division here, the cranial division. And so it plays a role in the production of saliva from the parotid gland. Okay, so don't forget, it has a role in your autonomic nervous system in addition. Okay, so taste and touch, posterior 1/3. Motor control of the stylopharyngeus muscle. That's one of the muscles it's in your pharynx. And then also it is going to stimulate from the parasympathetic division, saliva from the parotid gland, which here you can see a nice picture of the parotid gland. Right, it's right in front of the ear here. All right, vagus nerve. Now look at that picture to the left there, or excuse me, to the right. You can see all of the viscera that the vagus nerve innervates. It's a mixed nerve, so it will have sensory and motor components that are too numerous to list on just one slide here. All right, so when we're talking about, all right, the actual sensory, it gets sensory input from many, many visceral structures in the thorax and also in the abdominal region there. And then, of course, when we're talking about the motor role of the vagus nerve, just look at all of those organs there. And the vagus nerve is going to, one, control muscles that are going to be found in your throat and the pharynx there, also in your voice box and the larynx. And then it's also going to provide a lot of, we talked about this in lecture, a lot of that parasympathetic output, right? That whole rest and digest, all those processes, the vagus nerve is going to control the motor command outputs from the central nervous system out to various viscera here. All right, so there's a lot for vagus nerve. So like I said, if you're ever unsure, go with vagus nerve as your choice. Then we have our our accessory nerve. Sometimes the accessory nerve is called the spinal accessory nerve, not too often anymore, right? But cranial nerve 11 is purely motor, and it is going to control some of the muscles in your neck. For example, the trapezius muscle is one of those muscles, and the sternocleidoid mastoid muscle is another muscle in which the accessory nerve is going to innervate, right? And there's some various other pharyngeal muscles too, all right, that are located, and it'll assist the vagus with innervation of some of those muscles there. Finally, our last nerve is cranial nerve number 12, hypoglossal nerve. This nerve controls the muscles of the tongue. Okay, so it's interesting because when we're trying to find out if you're suspecting that the hypoglossal nerve is damaged, and remember, cranial nerves are paired, so you have a right hypoglossal nerve and the left hypoglossal nerve. And so if you're suspecting that that one of the hypoglossal nerves are damaged, simple thing to do is ask the person to stick their tongue out. And if they stick their tongue out and it points to one side, then the side that it's pointing to is the side that the hypoglossal nerve is damaged. Okay, because if you think about it, the right hypoglossal nerve is going to control all the muscles on the right side of your tongue, both the intrinsic and the extrinsic muscles. And then the left hypoglossal nerve will innervate all of the muscles on the left side of your tongue. So if that side, if the right hypoglossal nerve is damaged, then the muscles on the right of your tongue will not work. So when I ask you to stick your tongue out, the muscles that do work, which in our scenario is the left, all right, those muscles will push the tongue to the right because the muscles on the right aren't working. So the muscles on the left overpower and push it, and it points to the side. We joke around, we say, all right, the hypoglossal nerve, the tongue will point to the side of the lesion, and it tells you which hypoglossal nerve is damaged. So that's the last of the cranial nerves. Cranial nerve number 12, the hypoglossal nerve. All right. Okay. That concludes our cranial nerves. And so let's just finish up with the last part of our drawing, not drawing, excuse me, of our labeling. And we're going to finish up with the dural sinuses and the ventricles here. And then we will have completed all of the different, I can't think tonight, y'all. I apologize. Then we'll have completed all the labeling here. So let's start off here, all right, talking about, all right, the dural septa. And if you recall, the dural septa are the dura mater, the outer layer of the cranial meninges, is a dense irregular connective tissue. And normally it's two layers. Okay, you have the meningeal layer and the periosteal layer that are fused together. And in most places in the skull, it is fused together. And in some places, those two layers will separate away from one another. We'll talk about that in a moment. All right, but where it's fused together, it'll make these partitions or these separations. And so one of the bigger ones in your skull is the falx cerebri. The falx cerebri sits in the longitudinal fissure, and it separates the right and left cerebral hemispheres, while at the same time it helps to support the brain. So you can see here the falx cerebri. Now we can see it in this model here, okay? And it's just, it forms this partition that separates the two hemispheres from one another. So you'll see here in this superior view of the cranial cavity here, right, we have this structure called the falx cerebelli. So similar to the falx cerebri, the falx cerebelli is going to separate the two hemispheres of the cerebellum. So the falx cerebelli separates the left cerebellar hemisphere from the right cerebellar hemisphere. And then we have this structure here, the tentorium cerebelli, that is going to separate the occipital and temporal lobes of the cerebrum from the cerebellum that lies inferior to the tentorium cerebelli. I always thought of it like a tent flap. It'll cover over the cerebellum, and it separates those two regions of the brain from one another. So here you can see it in a little bit better positioning here in this model. And over here is where you would see, all right, the right cerebellar hemisphere that sits below the tentorium cerebelli. All right, now, if you recall, I did tell you, all right, the dural septa, right, the dura mater is fused. Those two layers are normally fused, but in some places it separates. And where it separates, it creates a space. We call those dural venous sinuses. And those sinuses are filled with venous blood that's draining from the brain. So this sinus here, all right, the topmost sinus is the superior sagittal sinus. So it's right below the cranial bones there. And so you can see it's quite large. Then you'll see below it, all right, the inferior sagittal sinus. Much smaller, but again, it will drain the venous blood from the brain there. And then the straight sinus is going to be located where the falx cerebri meets the tentorium cerebelli. And that's the straight sinus. And you can kind of see how the inferior sagittal sinus will drain down into the straight sinus, and that straight sinus goes straight back this way here. Then you have the transverse sinus, which sits here along the lateral margin of the tentorium cerebelli. I got a better picture of it. I'll show it to you in the skull. So here you can see that transverse sinus there. And that's where that tentorium cerebelli kind of meets up with the lateral portions here of the skull. And then back here, right, you can see the superior sagittal sinus kind of draining backwards and posteriorly. So on this picture, we're seeing, all right, that blue arrow, that blue line highlighted with yellow is representing where the longitudinal fissure is, but that's where the falx cerebri will fit into. And then you'll see here in between, all right, the cerebellum, specifically the occipital and temporal lobes, you'll see that the tentorium cerebelli will fit in between the cerebrum and the cerebellum there, separates them both from each other. or at the same time, it will support, all right, that the cerebrum there. What the heck is that? I thought Halloween was over. It looks scary to me. Well, folks, what you're looking at is an actual mold of your ventricular system inside your brain. So what we've done is, all right, we took a brain, we filled it up, all right, with a mold, let it harden, then we peeled the brain away, and this is what was left. So what you're looking at, and I'll show this to you from several different angles here, all right, but this is not anatomically correct. All right, so if you and I were standing facing one another, all right, look at the right side of the screen is going to be the left side of the model here. So this is not anatomically correct. This is the left lateral ventricle, what you're looking at. Then you can see here on the other side is our right lateral ventricle. Again, we are face to face. I'll show you what it looks like, all right, when we're anatomically correct. Here is our anatomically correct depiction. Now we're standing in line. I'm standing behind you, looking at the back of your head. This is anatomically correct. Right? The right side of our screen is the right lateral ventricle. Right? On the left side of our screen, this would be the left lateral ventricle right over here. So our lateral ventricles are going to drain into the third ventricle. And the structure that they drain into the third ventricle with is called the interventricular foramina, also known as the foramen of Monro. So the left lateral ventricle has its own interventricular foramina, and the right lateral ventricle has its own interventricular foramina. Here is the lateral view. Okay, so all of this right here is the lateral ventricle. All of this. It's a funky looking C-shaped structure, so to speak. So here's the interventricular foramina from the lateral view there. And then there's our left lateral ventricle. All right, so both lateral ventricles drain into the third ventricle. There's the third ventricle. Keep in mind, folks, that the third ventricle is surrounded by many of the structures of the diencephalon. Pretty much the diencephalon surrounds the third ventricle. In this area here, the third ventricle looks really similar to the hypothalamus, outline of the hypothalamus. And then the thalamus would be up in this region here. And then the epithalamus would be hanging more towards the back here. All right, so there's the third ventricle. The third ventricle drains down into the fourth ventricle. In case you're wondering where the fourth ventricle is located, it's located in the brainstem, just posterior or behind the pons, but anterior to the cerebellum. So the third ventricle drains into the fourth ventricle. Here you can see the fourth ventricle on the lateral view. So we have a structure. Okay, here you can see the fourth ventricle from the anterior view. So we have a structure that's going to connect the third and fourth ventricles to one another. And we call that the cerebral aqueduct. Long tube-like structure. Okay, the cerebral aqueduct connects the third and fourth ventricle to one another. And here it is from the lateral view. It's quite a ways from the third ventricle down to the fourth ventricle. But then again, I mean, you got to pass through the midbrain and then into the pons there. So here you can see the cerebral aqueduct in our brain model here. So this area here and here, there's the midbrain. So the third ventricle is this space all over here, all right, and it's going to drain cerebral spinal fluid down into the fourth ventricle here. All right, so now I do want to caution you that when you are taking the test and that there's an arrow pointing to that space, if it's just pointing to that area there of our model and there's no words, you won't get it wrong if you write hypothalamus. But if you look on the slide and it has space question mark, then it's asking you for the third ventricle. So write the third ventricle. Okay, always look, first glance. I noticed that a lot of people, when they're taking the test, they're not taking the full amount of time, which is fine. Everybody works at their own pace. I'm cool with that. All right. But I know I would be kicking myself in the butt if I took a test, got done in 34 minutes, and I missed 4 or 5 questions because I didn't take the time to make sure that I glanced at the slide to see, because everybody does it every semester. And I say this every semester and people still do it. All right. But there'll be something on there that will tell you specifically what we're looking for. And I can tell that students don't read that sometime and they'll type in their answer, right? And they're wrong because the slide asked for something different. So just do yourself a favor. First glance, scan the slide. If there's no words on it, you're good to go. Just identify whatever it is that the arrow is pointing at. All right, and there's the area for the fourth ventricle. Fourth ventricle. Okay, folks, we are kicking butt. And when I say we, you guys are doing a great job.